Welcome to ID the Future. I'm Robert Crowther at the Center for Science and Culture in Seattle, and joining us today is the distinguished Professor Bob Marks, and that distinguished part is no joke. His official title at Baylor University is Distinguished Professor of Engineering, and he's also a senior researcher at the Evolutionary Informatics Lab. He was the chair of the IEEE Neural Networks Committee, the first president of the IEEE Neural Networks Council, and for a number of years he was the editor-in-chief of their journal. So he really is distinguished, and distinguished enough that he is also the author of a recent book, a very accessible book that might sound scary to non-scientists or non-engineers, but I assure you it's an interesting read, not hard to follow. It's very good. The book is entitled Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics, which Bob co-authored with William Dembski and Winston Ewart, by the way. And I strongly encourage you all to read it if you have an interest in things like information theory, artificial intelligence, and so on. You can find Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics at Amazon.com. And whew, now that we've got all that out of the way, how are you today, Dr. Marks?
I am doing just right, as they say.
Good.
So thank you for the long introduction. I think we've used up our time, haven't we?
Yeah, so next time we'll be discussing, right?
Okay.
It's great to have you back. We've had previous discussions. I'm sure there will be a next time as well. But I wanted to talk a little bit today because recently there's been a lot in the news and in movies and TV shows and culture across the board, really, about artificial intelligence, and namely the threat that AI, as it's called, might pose to us, to humanity as a whole. And this isn't really fringe thinking. These are fairly dire warnings coming from some prominent people. Bill Gates has said that he doesn't understand why some people are not concerned about AI. And Elon Musk says AI is humanity's biggest existential threat. But the biggest one of all probably really is scientist Stephen Hawking that has really rung the alarm bell on this. And I want to quote this specifically. He has said in an interview recently, "I fear that AI may replace humans altogether. If people design computer viruses, someone will design AI that replicates itself. This will be a new form of life that will outperform humans." End quote. That's Hawking, Stephen Hawking, in Wired magazine. So I want to ask you, Dr. Marks, is he right? Is humanity doomed if we keep pursuing artificial intelligence?
Well, one of the questions you have to ask is, what does outperforming mean? Certainly my car outperforms me in terms of my speed.
Yes.
And the computer outperforms me in terms of adding numbers together. So one has to define what outperforming is. And yeah, they're outperforming us. I mean, we use them all the time to do calculator sort of stuff, to do our email. And it certainly has replaced the Pony Express. Yeah, it's doing better and better and better. Yes, so it will. But there are some things which I think are strongly indicated that a computer will never be able to replace. Those are things such as understanding. I think most importantly and most testable is the idea of creativity.
Yes.
Being sentient and consciousness. And computers, there is growing evidence, don't have the capability of reproducing human qualities in these areas.
Right. They don't have human feelings either, like empathy and so on.
Oh, I read, who was it, Deep Blue beat Kasparov? I forget who said it, but they said, Deep Blue is not human. He didn't get excited and go out with these buddies and have a big celebration afterwards. He didn't get a hot date with Deep Pink and go out and celebrate the victory. There was no human element associated with the winning of Deep Blue. So,
yeah, computers can do things, like you said, much better than we can as far as computations. They're computers. Not surprising, I suppose. But how do we differentiate between human and computer? At some point, apparently Hawking, Elon Musk, and these guys think that computers will be sentient, that they will be feeling and creative. Is that possible? Can that ever actually happen, do you think?
Well, I think you mentioned that Stephen Hawking is probably the most prominent brain technically of those that are making such statements. One of the surprising things I find about Hawkins is that, well, number one, he's kind of making strange things. He thinks we should start colonizing Mars because the world is going to explode in population and we need to really get out of here. And some of these kind of fringe sort of things. But the thing that surprises me about his statement on artificial intelligence replacing the human being in terms of these, what I believe are unattainable characteristics, is based on something that I don't think he understands, which is fundamental computer science theory, something that every computer science student learns in his first 2-3 years of class. And the curious thing about Hawkins is that he actually recognized limitations of algorithms back, I think it was maybe about 10 years ago, when he actually wrote an article in which he abandoned something called the theory of everything, which was the idea that maybe someday with string theory or something like that, we could capture all of physics in a few physical laws. But Turing came out and he says, no, this isn't going to happen because of something called Gödel's theorem. And he said, no matter what laws we capture, there will still be things which are outside the explanation of these laws. Well, actually, that same exact mathematics applies to humans, in that there are things that we can do that are non-algorithmic, that can't be done by a computer. And believe it or not, computers and algorithmic information theory grew out of Gödel's original idea. So he doesn't recognize the limitation of computers and the same sort of limitations that he talked about with the limitations of the theory of everything.
So he's abandoned the theory of everything except for in this area where computers could become everything, it sounds like. He doesn't recognize the same restraints on the computers that he recognizes on everything else?
Yes, exactly. For example, it was Alan Turing and the Turing machine wrote on the same sort of problems that Gödel wrote about. And I'm listening to his biography right now, and it's an excellent biography. But one of the things that Turing was actually able to show is that there are things which computers can't do. Now, this was back in the 30s. Why people don't recognize this and understand this, I don't understand. It's being popularized by people such as Roger Penrose and Hammerhoff, who is a guy that works with Penrose. But the idea is there are things which a computer can't do. You can't write a computer program to analyze another computer program, an arbitrary other computer program, to say whether that program will ever stop or not. That's non-algorithmic. You can't write programs to do that. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many things which are non-algorithmic or more commonly uncomputable. And I would put the idea of consciousness and understanding and creativity in that same category. You don't have the ability for a computer to do these things. Computers will never be creative.
So if computers can never achieve that, then really, I don't understand why he'd be so upset, except that he just doesn't recognize this.
He probably does. I'd be the last in the world to criticize Stephen Hawking because the guy is clearly a super brain.
Right. But that's why it's kind of hard to understand his position on this.
But here's the interesting thing. Stephen Hawking's PhD advisor was Roger Penrose. Mm-hmm. And together they wrote the Penrose-Hawking theorem of singularities, where they actually described the physics of the black hole. Mm-hmm. And so these guys have worked together. Penrose has come out and is totally opposite of Hawking because he wrote a couple of books called The Shadow of the Minds and I forget the second one off the top of my head. But he wrote these books looking at things such as Gödel's theorem and Turing machines and such, and saying the human is above and beyond that. And he is a materialist. He is not a theist or even a deist, but he believes that the answer lies within something called microtubules in our brain and the quantum effects in microtubules. And so that's where he's going after. That's where the creative sort of aspect comes. And his theory brings in this quantum sort of really weird stuff, which actually performs in a non-algorithmic sort of fashion. So that's where we get it. At least that's what Penrose says.
And being non-algorithmic means computers can't do it.
Computers can't do it. The only thing computers do are algorithms. They can only look at recipes that they are given by the computer program, step-by-step procedures to do things. And they can only do what they are told.
Interesting. So Then how can we figure out if something has intelligence? How do you test for intelligence? Is there a way to identify it?
Well, this was actually addressed by Alan Turing. In fact, the movie that was made out of this biography I'm listening to was called The Imitation Game.
Mm-hmm.
And The Imitation Game is motivated by the fact he wanted to do something which imitated a human being. That's what the imitation was about. And so he came up with a concept called the Turing test. And in it, his idea was that if we were on one side and a smart computer were on the other side, and we were to exchange dialogue, that we could not recognize whether that computer was a human being or a computer. Now, interestingly, the converse is very easily. I could test very easily to make sure that isn't a human. I would give him a big list of numbers to add up and see if they responded quickly. But he was interested, again, in the imitation of the human being. And this has been known as the Turing test. Now, the Turing test has been going on for a long time. A few years ago, there was a guy named Eugene Goostman who was a simulation of an artificial intelligence that was declared by the world's press that he had passed the Turing test. But the problem is, and I'm going to quote a guy named Summer Bringsjord now in a paper by Bringsjord, Bellew, and Ferrucci. He says, though progress towards Turing's dream is being made, it's coming only at the strength of clever but shallow trickery. For example, the human creators of artificial agents that compete in present-day versions of the Turing test know all too well that they have merely tried to fool those people who interact with their agents into believing that the agents really have minds. Now, the thing with Eugene Goostman, he was a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy. Do you think that was chosen arbitrarily? No. He was Ukrainian because, well, he's Ukrainian, so if he doesn't have perfect diction or speak proper English, well, his native language is right. Ukrainian, and we could do that. Number two, you could excuse him not knowing some of the deeper things in life because the kid's only 13 years old. So immediately the deck is stacked in terms of fooling people. And Bringsjord actually has discarded the Turing test because of this reason and has proposed something else, which is called the Lovelace test.
And what is the Lovelace test?
Well, the Lovelace test is from Bringsjord, and the basic idea of the Lovelace test is that computers cannot be creative. And you are passing the Lovelace test in terms of software if the software does something that the computer program doesn't understand. In other words, the computer program doesn't understand why and how the computer software has actually created something. Now, this is not the same thing as being surprised. I've written lots of software and I've been surprised by the output, but you know what? I look back at the actual program and I can see the reasons that it happened. We did some work in swarm intelligence where we actually applied computer evolution, if you will, to the development of swarms. And we found out remarkably that if one wanted to maximize the time that a swarm existed, that one of the solutions was actually self-sacrifice. One of the swarm elements would come around and all of the predators would chase it around, eating up time. They would finally get them, and then another one would break out. And we were surprised at that. But we looked back at the solution and we said, yes, this was in the realm of the solutions that we were able to give the computer. So yeah, we were able to explain the result, even though it was surprising. But creativity, if Deep Blue went by itself and began to learn Go, for example, then that would be something.
Right.
If you had a computer program that was fed all of the works of Bach, there's lots of computers which are said to be generating and writing computer music. And they feed them a bunch of things from Bach, a bunch of fugues and other stuff that Bach wrote. And guess what the music sounds like? It sounds like Bach music. But in no way is it ever going to come up and give a piece by a Stravinsky or a Schoenberg or some other sort of thing. It's not going to be creative, even artfully.
Right.
So the creativity is something which is above and beyond the reach of a computer.
Right, because the creativity would be an innovation, maybe?
Yes.
Or creation of brand new information. So by making something that sounds like Bach or some other piece of music isn't necessarily creation, and it's certainly not creating new information. The information would seem to be a big part of it.
Yes, and if you go back to the fundamental idea of creativity, you see that creativity is above and beyond the established status quo. And all the computer can do is look at kind of the status quo, what it has been taught. Creativity necessitates discarding the status quo and sometimes even rejecting it and going out and doing something new and innovative. Mm-hmm. So that's what a computer is unable to do.
So to sum up, artificial intelligence isn't getting so smart and creative that it's going to be killing us off anytime soon.
No, it isn't. I do think it's going to have an incredible impact on our society.
Oh, yeah.
But so did the Industrial Revolution,
Right.
It knocked all the farmers into the cities.
Well, that is something that we could discuss on a future episode of ID the Future. I think we're probably getting close to our time here, and I want to thank Bob Marks for being with us today.
Okay, well, thank you, Rob. Appreciate it.
And I want to remind listeners to check out his book. It is available at Amazon.com, Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics. And again, if you're interested in these kind of topics about artificial intelligence and so on, I think that book would be one that you'd like very much.
Could I also mention, Rob, our webpage, which
yes.
is evoinfo.org, EVOINFO, EVOINFO.org. And that contains all of the papers. The book is written kind of at a high level for general understanding. If people want to get down to the actual mathematics and the details, they should go to that website because all the papers are available there.
Right, and that's evoinfo.org, and it's a part of the Evolutionary Informatics Lab, right?
Yes, which consists of William Dembski and Winston Ewart and myself and a number of other really, really great people.
Great. Well, thank you for being here, Bob. I appreciate it. And if listeners want to check out other ID the Future podcasts, you can point your internet browser of choice to idthefuture.com. That's idthefuture.com. This is Robert Crowther for ID the Future. Thanks for listening.
This program was recorded by Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. ID the Future is copyright Discovery Institute. For more information, visit intelligentdesign.org and idthefuture.com.